The silence of the Athenaeum after hours was a living thing. It was a pressure in my ears, a weight on my shoulders, a presence that hummed in the deep, resonant way that only very old, very large buildings can. For years, this silence had been my closest companion, my collaborator. It was in this profound quiet that the ghosts of the paintings finally felt safe enough to speak to me. I was an art restorer, a specialist in the Dutch Golden Age, and my life was a meticulous, solitary process of coaxing vibrancy back into canvases that had been sleeping for centuries. My studio was a small, climate-controlled pocket on the fourth floor, a room that smelled perpetually of linseed oil, mineral spirits, and the faint, sweet decay of old varnish. Most nights, I worked until the city outside my arched window had exhaled its last commuter and settled into a low, electric thrum. I'd lose myself in the delicate work of painting, my world shrinking to the square inch of canvas under my magnifying lamp, to the single sable hair bristle of my finest brush. Time would dissolve. The guards knew my habits. Old Mr. Abernathy, a man whose bones seemed to be made of dust and kindness, would simply poke his head in around 2 in the morning, offer a wheezing, "Don't forget to live a little, son," and then leave me to my work, ensuring the side stairwell door was unlocked for my eventual, ghostly departure. It was a system built on comfortable neglect, one that had worked for the 3 years I'd been on contract with the Athenaeum. But on that Tuesday, something was different. I had been wrestling with the lace collar on a portrait of a stern-faced merchant's wife, a filigree of such frustrating complexity that the world outside my lamp ceased to exist entirely. When I finally leaned back, my spine cracking a protest, the clock on my wall read 3:17 a.m. My heart gave a familiar little lurch of panic and satisfaction. Another night stolen from the world. I cleaned my brushes with the methodical calm of ritual, capped my solvents, and covered the merchant's wife with a soft muslin cloth. I switched off the lamps, plunging the studio into the deep, velvety dark, broken only by the faint orange glow of the city filtering through the window. I grabbed my worn leather satchel, slung it over my shoulder, and slipped out into the hallway. The air here was cooler, carrying the scent of floor polish and aged paper from the archives next door. The silence was different out here, too. It was expectant. I took the staff corridor to the east wing, my soft-soled boots making almost no sound on the polished marble. My path was a familiar map of shadows and faint security lights. I was a phantom in my own workplace. The goal was the service stairwell at the far end of the building, the one that Mr. Abernathy always left for me. It was a cast-iron spiral staircase, a forgotten artery of the building that emptied into a small alleyway behind the dumpsters. It was my secret escape hatched from a life I often felt trapped in. I reached the heavy oak door, my hand closing over the cool, ornate brass handle. I turned it. Locked. A cold knot formed in my stomach. That had never happened before. I tried it again, jiggling it gently, then with more force. It was solid, unmoving. A flicker of real fear, sharp and unwelcome, went through me. Had Abernathy forgotten? Was he ill? The main doors were alarmed. My ID card wouldn't work the exits after midnight. I was, for all intents and purposes, trapped. A wave of irrational panic washed over me. I hated feeling trapped. My breath hitched. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the door, trying to think. There was one other way. A maintenance stairwell near the main rotunda. It was more exposed, its entrance just off the grand hall, but it also exited into the alley. It was a risk. The patrols were more frequent there. But it was my only option. My footsteps echoed now, loud and guilty in the cavernous space of the rotunda. The moonlight slanted through the high, domed ceiling, silvering the statues of forgotten city fathers, making them look like a council of disapproving ghosts. I felt their marble eyes on me as I hurried toward the alcove that hid the stairwell door. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. This felt different. Transgressive. I found the door, a plain, unmarked metal slab, and pulled. It swung open with a low groan that seemed to ricochet off every surface in the hall. I slipped inside, pulling it shut behind me, and was plunged into near-total darkness. The air was thick with the smell of dust and concrete. I fumbled for my phone, its screen flaring to life and momentarily blinding me. I turned on the flashlight, the weak beam cutting a nervous, bouncing path down the metal steps. It was a purely functional space, all exposed pipes and conduit. I started my descent, my hand gripping the cold metal railing, each footstep a loud, metallic clang in the enclosed space. One flight. Two. On the landing between the second and first floors, I paused, catching my breath, the silence pressing in again. And then it was broken. A soft scuff. From below me. I froze, my entire body going rigid. My light snapped off as if by instinct. I held my breath, listening. Every nerve ending was on fire. Was it a rat? A shifting pipe? Then I heard it again, closer this time. The unmistakable, rhythmic tread of heavy boots coming up the stairs. A guard. But Abernathy's wheezing shuffle was a sound I could identify from 100 yards away. This was a steady, silent, confident tread. This was someone new. My mind raced. I was cornered. There was nowhere to go. Up was back into the alarmed museum. Down was toward him. I pressed myself back against the cold concrete wall, trying to melt into the shadows, a completely ridiculous impulse. My heart was a battering ram in my chest. I could hear my own blood roaring in my ears. The footsteps stopped. A click, and the stairwell was flooded with the blinding, brutal light of a powerful flashlight. The beam danced up the walls, across the steps, and then it found me. It pinned me against the wall like a terrified moth. I threw a hand up to shield my eyes, blinking against the glare. "Don't move," a voice said. It wasn't the reedy, familiar call of Abernathy. This voice was low, calm, and carried an authority that vibrated right through the concrete floor. It was a voice that didn't need to be raised to be obeyed. The light lowered slightly, and I could make out a silhouette ascending the last few steps to my landing. He was tall, broad-shouldered, a solid shape of darkness against the light he wielded. He moved with an unnerving grace, not the plodding gait of a night watchman, but the economical, balanced movement of someone completely at home in their body. He stopped one step below me, putting us at eye level. The flashlight beam was now aimed at the floor between us, casting his face in stark, dramatic shadow. He was younger than I expected, maybe my age, early 30s. He had a strong jaw, dark hair cut short and neat, and eyes that, even in the dramatic light, seemed to absorb everything. They were dark, unreadable. There was no anger in his expression, no surprise. Just a quiet, unnerving watchfulness. "You're not supposed to be here," he said. It was a statement of fact, not an accusation. I know." I stammered, my voice sounding thin and reedy. "I'm sorry. I work here. I'm a restorer. I lost track of time." The east stairwell door was locked. My words tumbled out. A pathetic, clumsy confession. He didn't respond. He just watched me, his gaze unwavering. I felt like one of my paintings, being analyzed for cracks and imperfections. He took the final step up onto the landing, and the space, which had seemed large enough a moment ago, suddenly felt claustrophobically small. I could smell him then. Not a heavy cologne, but something subtle and clean, like sandalwood and cold night air. It was a grounding scent, a stark contrast to the frantic, chemical smell of my own fear. "ID," he said, his voice still low and even. I fumbled in my satchel, my fingers clumsy and slick with sweat. I pulled out my wallet, my hand shaking as I extracted my Athenaeum staff card and held it out to him. He didn't take it right away. His eyes flicked from the card to my face, then back again. Finally, he took it, his fingers brushing against mine. His touch was brief, but his skin was warm and firm. It sent a ridiculous, inappropriate jolt through me. He examined the card under the beam of his flashlight. "Leo," he read aloud, his voice giving my name a weight it didn't usually have. "Art restoration." He looked up at me again, his eyes lingering on my face. "You work late a lot, Leo." "Every night," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "Mr. Abernathy usually lets me out the east stairs." "Abernathy retired last week," he said, his tone flat. "I'm Julian." Julian. The name suited him. It was as solid and steady as he seemed to be. He handed my ID back. As I reached for it, he moved with a speed that startled me. His free hand came up and pressed flat against my chest, not hard, but with an immovable firmness. He backed me up until the cold, unforgiving edge of the iron railing pressed into the small of my back. The metal was a sharp, grounding line against my spine. My breath caught in my throat. "What's in the bag?" he asked, his eyes never leaving mine. His gaze was intense, searching. Just my things, I said, my voice cracking. My wallet, keys. A book. Open it. I fumbled with the clasp on my satchel, my fingers feeling like useless sausages. I held it open for his inspection. He shone the light inside, the beam illuminating the mundane contents of my life. A dog-eared paperback, a half-eaten protein bar, a sketchbook. He seemed satisfied, but he didn't move back. If anything, he leaned in closer. The space between us was electric. I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. I was acutely aware of the steady rise and fall of his chest, the solid wall of muscle beneath his uniform shirt. Building policy is strict, he said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to be for my ears only. Nothing leaves this building that doesn't belong to staff. His eyes dropped from my face, traveled down my body, and then came back up to meet my gaze. Take off your shirt. My brain short-circuited. What? Your shirt, he repeated, his voice patient, but with a steel edge that allowed for no argument. It's policy. I have to make sure you're not concealing anything. My face flushed with heat. This was absurd, humiliating. But looking into his calm, resolute eyes, I knew arguing was pointless. He held all the power in this dark, forgotten corner of the museum. With trembling fingers, I began to unbutton my worn flannel shirt. The sound of the small buttons sliding through the holes was deafeningly loud in the silence. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely manage the last one. He watched my clumsy efforts without a word, his expression unreadable. I pulled the shirt open, the cool air of the stairwell hitting my skin, raising goosebumps. I let it hang open, feeling exposed, vulnerable. Off, he said, his voice softer now, but no less firm. I swallowed hard and shrugged out of the shirt, letting it fall from my numb fingers to the concrete floor. I stood there, bare-chested in the stark beam of his flashlight, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The light played over my pale skin, my too thin frame. I was a mess of nerves and anxiety, laid bare for his inspection. He didn't say anything for a long moment. His eyes scanned my chest, my stomach, my arms. It wasn't a leering gaze, nothing overtly sexual, but it was thorough. It was an inventory, and it was the most intensely intimate scrutiny I had ever been under. I felt the heat rising in my neck, a deep, mortifying blush that I prayed he couldn't see in the dim light. I wanted to fold in on myself, to disappear. Then, his gaze softened almost imperceptibly. A flicker of something I couldn't name crossed his face. He reached out, not to touch me, but to pick up my shirt from the floor. He held it for a second, then extended it to me. All right, he said, his voice returning to its even, neutral tone. You're clear. I took the shirt, my fingers brushing his again. This time, the contact lingered for a heartbeat longer. I quickly pulled the shirt back on, not bothering with the buttons, just wanting to cover myself. I felt stripped bare, not just physically, but emotionally. He had seen past my carefully constructed walls of solitude, had seen the trembling, uncertain person underneath. The east door will be locked from now on, he said, stepping back and finally giving me space to breathe. And I do a full sweep of the building at 1 a.m. If you're here after that, you'll have to check out with me at the security desk. Understood. I just nodded, unable to find my voice. Go on, he said, gesturing down the stairs with his flashlight. I'll let you out. I scurried past him, my cheeks still burning, and hurried down the remaining flight of stairs. He followed behind, his footsteps a steady, unnerving presence. At the bottom, he keyed a code into a panel, and the heavy metal door clicked open, revealing the dark, rain-slicked alley. The cool night air was a shock, a welcome slap in the face. I hesitated at the threshold, turning back to him. He stood in the doorway, a tall silhouette against the dim light of the stairwell. Thank you, I managed to say. He just gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Don't be late again, Leo. And then he closed the door, the lock engaging with a final, definitive thud. I was left alone in the alley, the scent of rain and garbage filling my lungs, my heart still racing from an encounter that had lasted no more than 5 minutes, but had completely upended the quiet, predictable rhythm of my world. I stood there for a long time, my shirt unbuttoned, the cold air on my skin a faint echo of his searching gaze. The next night, I was a wreck. I sat at my workstation, staring at the merchant's wife, but I couldn't see her. All I could see were Julian's dark, unreadable eyes. All I could feel was the ghost of his hand on my chest, the cold iron of the railing at my back. I replayed the encounter over and over in my head, each time my face burning with a fresh wave of humiliation and a strange, unwelcome flicker of something else. Something that felt dangerously like excitement. I was terrified of seeing him again, and yet, a part of me, a deep, lonely part one rarely acknowledged, was desperate too. I watched the clock on the wall, the minutes ticking by with agonizing slowness. At 10, I started packing up. Then I unpacked. At 11, I decided to leave early to avoid him completely. I got as far as the hallway before turning back. It was pathetic. I was a grown man, undone by a night guard. I forced myself to work, to lose myself in the intricate details of a painted pearl earring. But the silence of the Athenaeum was no longer a comfort. It was charged, expectant. I kept imagining the sound of his steady footsteps in the hall. Every creak of the old building made me jump. At precisely 1 o'clock, I heard it. The soft click of a door down the corridor, followed by the faint, rhythmic squeak of rubber-soled boots on marble. My heart leaped into my throat. He was doing his sweep, just as he said he would. I held my breath, listening as the footsteps grew closer. They paused outside my studio. I could feel his presence on the other side of the door, a tangible pressure in the air. I imagined him standing there, listening. Could he hear the frantic beat of my heart? After a moment that stretched into an eternity, the footsteps moved on. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, my body slumping with a mixture of profound relief and a sharp, surprising pang of disappointment. He hadn't come in. He had just walked by? This became our new routine. A silent, nocturnal dance. I would work, my senses on high alert, and at 1 a.m., Julian's patrol would bring him past my door. He never came in. He never spoke. But I knew he was there. His presence was a quiet, constant weight in the back of my mind. I started leaving my door slightly ajar, a silent, cowardly invitation. I'd find myself looking toward it, waiting, listening. My observation of him became a quiet obsession. Sometimes, I'd see him on the security monitors near the staff lounge. I'd watch his spectral, grayscale form moving through the silent galleries. He moved with a purpose and a quiet grace that was captivating. He would pause before a painting, his head tilted, and I'd wonder what he was thinking. Did he see the stories, the ghosts, the centuries of history sealed under layers of varnish? Or did he just see assets to be protected? One night, about 2 weeks after our first meeting, I was working on cleaning a section of sky on a landscape. The original cerulean blue had been obscured by a century of grime and yellowed varnish. It was delicate, painstaking work. I was so engrossed, I didn't hear him. "It's brighter." The voice, low and close, made me jolt so violently that I nearly dropped my solvent-soaked cotton swab on the canvas. I spun around in my chair. Julian was standing just inside the doorway, which I'd left open as usual. He wasn't in shadow this time. The soft, diffuse light of my studio illuminated his face. He was even more handsome than I had realized in the stark light of the stairwell. He had a small, faded scar that cut through his left eyebrow, giving his otherwise stoic face a touch of vulnerability. His eyes, I saw now, weren't black, but a very deep, warm brown. "You scared me." I breathed, my heart doing a frantic tap dance against my ribs. "Sorry," he said, and he sounded like he meant it. He took a step into the room, his gaze fixed on the painting on my easel. "I saw it on the monitor last week." The sky looked dingy. "It was," I said, finding my professional footing. "It was a relief to talk about work. It's a layer of oxidized varnish. It yellows over time, obscuring the artist's original intent." I gestured to the small, brilliant blue square I had cleaned. "This is the color it's supposed to be." He moved closer, stopping a few feet from my easel. He looked from the cleaned patch to the rest of the murky canvas. He was quiet for a long moment, studying it. I found myself studying him. The way his dark uniform fit perfectly across his broad shoulders. The way his hands were clasped loosely behind his back. He had strong, capable-looking hands. I remembered the feeling of them on my chest, the warmth and firmness of his touch. I quickly looked away, my face growing hot. "So you strip away the old stuff to find what's underneath," he said, more to himself than to me. His eyes were still on the painting, but his words seemed to hold a different weight. That's the simplest way to put it, yes? I said. He finally turned his gaze from the painting to me. Must be satisfying to bring something back like that. It is, I admitted. It feels important. Like I'm keeping a promise to someone who died a long time ago. A small, slow smile touched his lips. It transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making his eyes crinkle at the corners. It was a devastatingly beautiful smile. I get that, he said, keeping things safe. We stood there in a comfortable silence for a moment. The air was thick with the smell of my solvents and his subtle, clean scent. It was an odd but not unpleasant combination. I brought you this, he said, and I realized he was holding a thermos. He stepped forward and placed it on the edge of my work table. It's coffee. You look like you could use it. I stared at the battered, stainless steel thermos as if it were a priceless artifact. Oh, you didn't have to do that. I make too much anyway, he said with a slight shrug. He unscrewed the cap, which doubled as a cup, and poured a stream of dark, fragrant coffee into it. The rich, bitter aroma filled the small studio. He held the cup out to me. Our fingers brushed as I took it. It was happening again. That small electric shock. But this time it wasn't accompanied by fear. The warmth of the cup seeped into my cold hands. I took a sip. It was strong, black, and ridiculously good. This is really good, I said, surprised. My only marketable skill besides looking intimidating in the dark, he said, and the corner of his mouth twitched again. I laughed. A real, actual laugh. The sound felt foreign in the quiet of my studio. Well, you're good at that, too. His smile widened slightly. Glad to hear it. He lingered for another moment, his presence a warm, solid anchor in my solitary world. Well, I've got rounds to finish. He gave a small nod toward the painting. Don't stay up all night chasing promises, Leo. And then he was gone, his footsteps receding down the hall, leaving me alone with the brilliant patch of blue sky, the scent of good coffee, and the lingering warmth of his smile. I held the cup in both hands, staring at the empty doorway. The silence that returned was different now. It was no longer a companion. It was just an absence. The absence of him. His nightly visits became our new ritual. He'd appear at my door sometime after his 1 a.m. sweep, a thermos of coffee in his hand. He'd pour me a cup, and we would talk. Not about anything deep or personal, at first. We talked about the paintings. He'd ask questions, and he was a surprisingly good listener. He wanted to know about pigments, about how I could tell a forgery from an original, about the lives of the people in the portraits. I, in turn, started to learn about him in small, fragmented pieces. He'd been in the army. He was taking online classes in forestry. He liked the quiet of the night shift. He spoke in an understated, declarative way, never offering more information than was necessary, but I hoarded every small detail like a treasure. I learned the story of the scar over his eye, a training accident, not nearly as dramatic as I'd imagined. I learned he had a dog, a goofy golden retriever named Buster. I found myself looking forward to his visits with a desperate, childish eagerness. The last hour of my work was always a struggle to focus, my ears straining for the sound of his approach. His presence filled my small, sterile studio with a life and warmth it had never had before. I started tidying up before he arrived, wiping down my tables, organizing my brushes. I even bought a second mug, a simple ceramic one, so he wouldn't have to drink from the thermos cap. The first time I offered it to him, he paused, looking at the mug in my outstretched hand. A strange expression crossed his face, one I couldn't quite decipher. Then he took it, his fingers closing over mine for a fraction of a second too long. Thanks, he said, his voice a little rough. That touch, it became a focal point of my obsessive internal analysis. It was just a touch, a fleeting, meaningless contact. But it didn't feel meaningless. It felt intentional. I replayed it in my mind, dissecting the pressure of his fingers, the warmth of his skin. Was I imagining it? Was this just a manifestation of my own profound loneliness, my desire for connection creating meaning where there was none? The touches became more frequent, a hand brushing my shoulder as he leaned in to look at a detail on a canvas, his knee bumping against mine as he sat on the stool I'd brought in for him. Each time, my body would react with a jolt, a silent, internal gasp. And each time, I would spend hours afterward analyzing it, questioning it, torturing myself with hope and doubt. One night, there was a storm. The rain lashed against the high arched windows of my studio, and the wind howled around the old building's eaves. The lights flickered once, twice, and then, with a groan from the emergency generator in the basement, went out completely. We were plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness. "Stay put," Julian's voice came, calm and steady from across the small room. I heard a rustle, and then the powerful beam of his flashlight cut through the blackness. He didn't shine it in my face this time, but aimed it at the ceiling, bathing the room in a soft, indirect light. My heart was pounding, a primal fear of the dark kicking in. "What happened?" "Power grid must be down," he said, his voice a reassuring anchor in the sudden chaos. "Generator should be powering the security systems and emergency lights, but it looks like this wing's on a different circuit." He walked over to the window, peering out at the blacked-out city. "Yep, the whole block is dark." He turned back to me, the flashlight beam illuminating the concern on his face. "You okay?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure he could see me. "Yeah, just startled." "We'll have to walk the galleries," he said, his tone all business now. "Make sure all the emergency systems are functioning. You should probably come with me. Don't want you sitting up here in the dark." The thought of walking through the vast, dark museum with only a single flashlight beam was terrifying. But the thought of doing it with him was something else entirely. "Okay," I said, my voice quiet. He led the way, his light a steady beacon. The Athenaeum was a different creature in the dark. The shadows were deeper, the silence more profound. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch us pass, their painted eyes gleaming in the moving light. The marble statues looked like frozen specters. I found myself walking closer to Julian than I normally would, the proximity of his solid, warm body a comfort against the oppressive darkness. As we navigated a narrow corridor in the antiquities wing, my foot caught on an uneven flagstone. I stumbled, letting out a small cry as I pitched forward into the blackness. Before I could fall, a strong arm snaked around my waist, pulling me back against a hard, solid chest. "Whoa, got you," Julian murmured, his voice right beside my ear. His breath was warm against my neck. I was flush against him, my back pressed into the front of his body. His arm was a steel band around me, holding me securely. I could feel the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart against my shoulder blades. My own heart felt like it was going to explode. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his skin, of his laundry detergent, of him. It was overwhelming. I should have pulled away. I should have thanked him and stepped back. But I couldn't move. I just stood there, leaning into him, my body trembling slightly. He didn't let go. His arm remained firmly around my waist, his other hand coming to rest on my shoulder, steadying me. We stood like that for a long moment in the pitch-black hallway, surrounded by ancient, sleeping artifacts. The only sounds were the drumming of the rain against the roof and the sound of our breathing, which seemed to have fallen into the same rhythm. This is it. This is the moment I analyze for the rest of my life. He shifts slightly, his hand on my shoulder tightening its grip. "You all right, Leo?" His voice is a low rumble, vibrating through his chest into my back. I can't speak. I can only manage a nod, my head brushing against his jaw. The contact, skin on skin, sends a tremor through my entire body. I feel him inhale sharply. I am acutely aware of every single point of contact between our bodies. The solid wall of his chest, the strong circle of his arm, the light pressure of his fingers on my shoulder. He doesn't move away. He doesn't release me. For a second, I think he leans in closer, that I feel the warmth of his lips near my temple. But it must be my imagination. It has to be. Finally, with what feels like a monumental effort, he loosens his grip. He takes a small step back, but his hand remains on my arm, a warm, grounding weight. "Careful," he says, his voice a little hoarse. "These floors are uneven." The rest of the patrol passed in a blur of charged silence. We didn't speak. The only sounds were our footsteps and the storm outside. But the air between us had changed. The comfortable quiet we had built over weeks of coffee and conversation had been replaced by a dense, humming tension. Every accidental brush of our arms as we walked, every shared glance in the half-light, felt loaded with unspoken meaning. When the power finally flickered back on, flooding the hallway with the harsh, fluorescent glare of the emergency lights, we both blinked, as if waking from a dream. We were standing in the main rotunda, and the sudden brightness felt like an intrusion, a violation of the intimate darkness we had shared. He finally dropped his hand from my arm. I missed its warmth instantly. "Looks like we're back," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Yeah," I said, equally careful. I couldn't meet his eyes. I stared at the intricate pattern of the marble floor, my mind racing. Had I imagined it all? The lingering hold? The sharp intake of breath? The almost kiss? "I should get back to my studio," I said, gesturing vaguely up the grand staircase. "Leo." I stopped, but I still couldn't look at him. "The city says it could be another hour or so before the grid is stable," he said. "You should probably just pack up and head home for the night." It was a practical suggestion, a sensible one, but it felt like a dismissal. He was sending me away. The fragile bubble of intimacy had burst. "Right. Okay," I said, my voice flat. I turned and walked toward the stairs, feeling his eyes on my back the entire way. The next few nights were excruciatingly awkward. Julian still brought coffee, but the easy conversation was gone. We spoke in stilted, polite sentences. We talked about the weather. We talked about a new acquisition in the Egyptian wing. We talked about everything except the storm, the darkness, and the moment I had been pressed against his body in the silent hallway. The space between us felt like a chasm. He would sit on his stool, I would sit in my chair, and the silence would stretch, thick and uncomfortable. The touches stopped. He was careful to keep his distance, to avoid any accidental contact. And it was killing me. The doubt was eating me alive. I had imagined it. I had built a fantasy out of a simple, human reaction. He was just being kind, preventing a clumsy art restorer from falling on his face. And I, in my pathetic loneliness, had turned it into a romance. I started to withdraw. It was a defense mechanism I had perfected over a lifetime of disappointment. I became quieter, offering one-word answers to his questions. I started leaving my studio door closed, a clear signal. Some nights, I would pack up and leave before he even started his rounds, unable to face the strained silence. I thought he would take the hint. I thought he would stop coming. But he didn't. Every night, I would hear him pause outside my closed door. I'd sit in the silence, my brush frozen over the canvas, holding my breath, waiting. He would stand there for a minute, maybe two, and then I'd hear his footsteps move on. He was respecting my boundary, but he was also refusing to disappear. It was a quiet, stubborn persistence that I didn't know what to do with. One night, I was exhausted. I had been struggling with a particularly damaged piece, a portrait where the subject's face was a network of fine cracks, a spiderweb of age and neglect. It felt personal. I felt like that portrait. I had worked for hours, my back aching, my eyes burning, and I had made no progress. Frustrated, I had pushed back from my table and, without meaning to, had fallen asleep in my chair. I was woken by a gentle touch on my shoulder. I surfaced from a dream of falling, my body jerking with a gasp. My first thought was that I was back in the dark hallway. "Hey, Leo, it's okay." Julian's voice, low and soft. I blinked, my eyes struggling to focus. He was kneeling in front of my chair, his face level with mine. The harsh overhead lights of the studio were off. The only illumination came from my small desk lamp, casting a warm, intimate glow over us. His face was filled with a concern so open, so unguarded, that it stole my breath. "You were having a nightmare," he said, his hand still a warm, reassuring weight on my shoulder. I ran a hand through my messy hair, feeling disoriented and embarrassed. "Sorry, I must have drifted off." "You're exhausted," he said. It wasn't an accusation, just a gentle statement of fact. His eyes searched my face. "You've been avoiding me." There it was. The thing we hadn't been talking about, laid bare between us in the quiet of the night. My stomach twisted into a knot. I couldn't deny it. I just looked away, focusing on the chaos of my work table. I've been busy." I lied, my voice weak. "No, you haven't," he said, his voice still soft, but firm. He didn't let me look away. He used his other hand to gently cup my jaw, turning my face back to his. His thumb stroked softly against my cheek. The gesture was so tender, so unexpected, that my eyes filled with tears. "Leo," he whispered, his gaze intense, searching. "What are you so afraid of?" The question hung in the air between us. It was the question I had been asking myself for years. I was afraid of everything. I was afraid of being hurt. I was afraid of being seen. I was afraid of wanting something I couldn't have. And most of all, right now, I was afraid of what I saw in his eyes. It looked too much like what I was feeling in my own heart. I don't know what this is, I finally managed to say, my voice thick with unshed tears. I don't want to misunderstand. A sad, gentle smile touched his lips. What do you think you're misunderstanding? He asked, his thumb continuing its soothing motion on my skin. I couldn't answer. I just looked at him, my defenses crumbling, my carefully constructed walls turning to dust. The vulnerability I felt was terrifying, but it was also a profound relief. I was so tired of being alone. He seemed to understand. He leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away. His eyes never left mine, asking a question his lips had not yet formed. My heart was hammering, a frantic, wild thing in my chest. This is happening. This is real. I didn't pull away. I closed my eyes. His lips met mine. It wasn't a hard, demanding kiss. It was soft, hesitant, a question. It was a whisper of warmth and the faint taste of the coffee he must have been drinking. It was tentative, searching, and it was the most honest thing I had ever felt. All the tension, all the doubt, all the fear that had been churning inside me for weeks simply dissolved. I let out a shaky breath, and my hands came up to rest on his shoulders. I could feel the solid muscle beneath his shirt. I leaned into the kiss, answering his question with my own. Yes, this is real. Yes, this is what I want. He deepened the kiss then, his hand moving from my jaw to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair. His other arm came around my waist, pulling me forward in the chair until there was no space left between us. It was no longer hesitant. It was a kiss of profound relief, of shared loneliness, of a connection that had been building in silence and shadows for weeks. It was the feeling of a lock clicking open. It was the feeling of coming home. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes still closed. I could feel the slight tremor in his hands. He wasn't as unshakably calm as I had always thought. He was just as nervous, just as vulnerable as I was. Leo, he breathed, his voice rough with emotion. Julian, I whispered back, my own voice unsteady. We stayed like that for a long time, foreheads pressed together in the small pool of lamplight, the rest of the world fading away. The silent, sleeping museum was our witness. The ghosts in the paintings were our audience. In that small, quiet room, surrounded by things that had been broken and were slowly being made whole again, I felt like I was finally one of them. The morning after was a new kind of terror. I woke up on the small, uncomfortable cot I kept in the back of my studio, a place I usually only used when I was too exhausted to even consider the commute home. My first thought was of Julian. The memory of the kiss, of the feeling of his forehead pressed against mine, was so vivid it was like a physical ache in my chest. But as the gray morning light began to filter through the window, so did the doubt. Panic, cold and familiar, began to seep in. He had left shortly after our kiss, a quiet, reluctant departure that had ended with him squeezing my hand at the doorway. There had been no grand declarations, no plans made. Just a lingering look and a whispered, "Get some sleep." What if it was just a moment? A product of exhaustion and shared intimacy in the dead of night? What if, in the harsh light of day, he regretted it? The thought was a physical blow. I curled in on myself, the thin blanket pulled up to my chin. I was an expert at self-sabotage, at snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. My mind, my greatest enemy, started listing all the reasons it was a mistake. He was probably just being kind. He felt sorry for the sad, lonely art restorer. It was a fluke. I couldn't face him. I couldn't bear to see the pity, or, worse, the polite disinterest in his eyes. I gathered my things in a frantic rush, my hands shaking. I practically ran from the museum, my ID card swiping me out into the bustling morning crowds. I didn't look at the security desk as I passed. I just fled, like a criminal from the scene of a crime. I spent the day in a fog of anxiety. I didn't go home. I wandered through the city, ending up at a small, anonymous coffee shop miles from the Athenaeum. I sat by the window, nursing a single cup of coffee for hours, watching people pass by. They all looked so certain, so sure of where they were going. I felt like a ghost, completely untethered. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text message. My heart leaped into my throat. I pulled it out with a trembling hand. It was from a number I didn't recognize. Hope you got some rest. You left your mug. It was him. My breath hitched. It was such a simple, mundane message. But it was everything. He wasn't ignoring me. He wasn't pretending it didn't happen. He had noticed I was gone. He had noticed my mug. The simple ceramic mug I had bought for him. I stared at the message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the keypad. What could I possibly say? My mind was a blank slate of panic. Thank you. Sorry I ran away like a coward. I'm hopelessly in love with you. Before I could formulate a reply, another message came through. I get off at 7. We could get some breakfast. If you want. Breakfast. In the sunlight. Away from the shadows and the silence of the museum. It was a test. It was an invitation into the real world. My fear was a physical thing, a cold hand gripping my insides. But underneath the fear was a tiny, fragile flicker of hope. What if it wasn't a mistake? What if it was real? I thought about my life. The quiet, solitary routine. The conversations with ghosts on canvas. It was safe. It was predictable. But it was so lonely. Julian was offering something else. Something terrifying and uncertain, but something that was vibrant and alive. My fingers moved before I could second-guess myself. Yes, I'd like that. I told him where I was, and he replied with a simple, stay put. I'm on my way. The 45 minutes I had to wait were the longest of my life. I was a bundle of raw nerves. What were we going to say? How were we supposed to act, now that everything had changed? When I saw him walking down the street toward the coffee shop, my heart started to pound. He wasn't in his uniform. He was wearing a simple gray t-shirt and jeans. He looked normal. He looked like a regular person, not the stoic, intimidating guard who had pinned me against a wall. And somehow, that was even more terrifying. He came inside, his eyes scanning the room until they found me. A slow, gentle smile spread across his face, the same one that had devastated me in my studio. All the tension in my shoulders eased. He walked over to my table and slid into the chair opposite me. Hey, he said, his voice the same low, calming rumble. Hi, I managed to say, my voice a little shaky. He looked at me, his gaze soft and searching. He didn't say anything about me running away. He just reached across the table and took my hand. His palm was warm and slightly calloused, and his fingers laced through mine as if they were made to be there. He gave my hand a gentle squeeze. I wasn't sorry about last night, Leo, he said, his voice quiet, for my ears only. Were you? I looked down at our joined hands, at the way his strong, capable fingers were intertwined with my own, which were perpetually stained with pigment. I thought of the fear, the doubt, the lifetime of loneliness that had led me to this exact moment. And I thought of the profound, earth-shattering relief of his kiss. I looked up and met his gaze, my heart finally, blessedly still. No, I said, and my voice was clear and steady. I wasn't sorry at all. His smile widened, and it was like the sun coming out after a long, dark storm. Good, he said, because I've been wanting to do that since the night I found you in the stairwell. My jaw dropped slightly. You have not. I have, he insisted, a playful glint in his eyes. You were standing there, all terrified and defiant, with your shirt unbuttoned. It was a very compelling combination. I felt a blush creep up my neck, but this time, it wasn't from humiliation. I laughed, a real, happy sound that turned a few heads in the quiet coffee shop. I was not defiant. I was about to wet myself. See? Compelling, he said with a grin. He squeezed my hand again. Come on. I know a place that has pancakes that will change your life. We walked out of the coffee shop, our hands still linked. The morning sun was bright, and the city was noisy and alive around us. It was a world away from the silent, nocturnal life I had been living. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt solid. I felt seen. I felt real. The diner was loud and bright, smelling of coffee and bacon. It was everything the Athenaeum wasn't. We sat in a worn vinyl booth, and the awkwardness I had feared never materialized. We talked. We really talked. He told me about growing up in a small town in Oregon, about his dream of working in a national park. I told him about my passion for art, about how I felt more comfortable with people who had been dead for 400 years than I did with most living ones. He didn't laugh. He just listened, his expression thoughtful. It makes sense, he said, after I'd finished a long, rambling explanation of my work. They can't hurt you. His perception was a sharp, clean cut straight to the heart of the matter. He saw me. He understood the fear that drove me, the fear he had asked about in my studio. "No," I said quietly. "They can't. But they can't surprise you, either," he added, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on the back of my hand. "They can't bring you coffee when you're falling asleep. They can't kiss you in the middle of the night." My breath caught. The simple, direct way he spoke was a revelation. There were no hidden meanings, no subtext to analyze. It was just the truth, laid out on the table between us next to the salt and pepper shakers. Our relationship began to take shape in the daylight. We met for breakfast after his shifts. We went for walks in the park with his dog, Buster, a ridiculously friendly beast who immediately adopted me as his second favorite person. Julian showed me his world, a world of sunlight and fresh air and simple, uncomplicated pleasures. And I, in turn, showed him mine. I took him through the Athenaeum during the day, when it was filled with the chatter of tourists and school groups. I showed him my favorite pieces, not as a restorer, but as someone who loved them. I told him the stories behind the paintings, the scandals and the heartbreaks and the triumphs of the people immortalized on canvas. He would listen, his attention focused entirely on me, his presence a warm, steady anchor in the bustling crowds. There were still moments of fear. Old habits die hard. A part of me was always waiting for the other shoe to drop, for him to realize I was too quiet, too anxious, too broken. The first time he stayed the night at my small, cluttered apartment, I lay awake for hours, listening to the sound of his slow, even breathing, my mind a maelstrom of insecurity. He must have sensed it. He stirred in his sleep, his arm coming around me, pulling me against his warm, solid back. He mumbled something incoherent and settled, his body a protective shield around mine. In the circle of his arms, the anxieties quieted. The fear receded. I felt safe. I felt home. Our first test came in the form of a gossipy day shift guard named Marjorie, a woman whose main source of entertainment was the lives of her co-workers. She saw Julian waiting for me by the staff entrance one morning, saw the way he smiled when I walked out, the way I leaned in and accepted a soft, quick kiss. The whispers started the next day. I felt the stares in the staff lounge. I heard the snickers in the hallway. It was exactly what I had always feared. The judgment, the scrutiny. I felt myself retreating, the old walls starting to creep back up. That night, I was quiet, distant. Julian noticed immediately. We were in my studio, the familiar ritual of coffee a comforting presence in the midst of my anxiety. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice gentle. I shrugged, pushing a stray brush around on my table. "Nothing, Leo," he said, his voice firm but kind. He waited until I looked at him. "Talk to me." And so I did. I told him about Marjorie, about the stares and the whispers. I told him how much I hated it, how it made me want to disappear. I expected him to tell me to ignore it, to be stronger. But he didn't. He just listened, his expression serious. When I was done, he reached out and took my hand. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry people are cruel." He was quiet for a moment. "Do you want me to stop?" To be more discreet. The question hung in the air. He was offering me an out. He was offering to go back into the shadows with me, to protect our fragile connection by hiding it away. A part of me, the scared, cowardly part, wanted to scream yes. But then I looked at him. I looked at his strong, honest face, at the open concern in his deep brown eyes. I thought of his easy smile, of the way he moved through the world without apology, hiding what we had felt like a betrayal. It felt like an insult to the beautiful, real thing that was growing between us. "No," I said, and the word felt powerful on my tongue. "No, I don't want to hide." A slow, proud smile spread across his face. He brought my hand to his lips and kissed my knuckles. "Good," he said, "because I'm not ashamed of you. I'm not ashamed of us." The next morning, he was waiting for me at the staff entrance again. Marjorie was there, pretending to sort mail, her eyes darting toward us. Julian ignored her completely. He wrapped his arms around me, pulled me close, and gave me a long, slow kiss, right there in the middle of the hallway. It wasn't a defiant act. It was just a simple, honest statement. "This is us. We are here." I heard Marjorie make a small, scandalized noise. I didn't care. I kissed him back, the morning light streaming through the high windows, the sounds of the museum waking up around us. In that moment, the fear was gone. It was replaced by something stronger, something solid. A few weeks later, Julian came to my studio with a strange look on his face. He was holding a brochure. "I got the job," he said, his voice quiet. I looked at the brochure. It was for a national park, hundreds of miles away. A park ranger position. His dream job. My heart did a complicated, painful flip in my chest. Joy for him, and a cold, sharp dread for myself. That's amazing, Julian," I said, and I was proud that my voice didn't shake. "When do you start?" 6 weeks, he said. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at the brochure in his hands. The silence in the room was deafening, heavier than it had ever been. This was it. The end of our nocturnal, art-filled world. He finally looked up at me, his face etched with worry. "I want you to come with me." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. "What? Come with me," he repeated, stepping closer. He took my hands. "Leo, I know it's crazy. I know this is your life, your work is here. But I can't. I don't want to do it without you. We can figure it out. You could do freelance work. There are museums in the city nearby. We can make it work." He was rambling, his usual calm composure gone, replaced by a desperate, hopeful urgency. He was scared. He was scared of losing me. And in that moment, I knew. All the lingering doubts, all the traces of fear, they vanished. This wasn't a fleeting moment. This wasn't a temporary fix for loneliness. This was real. This was a future. I thought about the Athenaeum, the quiet halls, the silent companions on the walls. It had been my sanctuary, my hiding place. But it was also a cage. A beautiful, gilded cage that had kept me safe, but had also kept me from living. Julian was offering me the world outside the walls. A world with sunlight and tall trees and the sound of his laughter. It was a terrifying, exhilarating leap into the unknown. I looked at him, at this steady, kind, wonderful man who had found me cowering in a dark stairwell and had, with infinite patience, led me into the light. "Okay," I whispered. His eyes widened. "Okay, okay," I said again, a smile spreading across my face, a real, genuine smile that came from a place of deep, uncomplicated joy. "Yes, I'll come with you." The relief that washed over his face was so profound it almost brought me to my knees. He pulled me into his arms, lifting me off the ground, his laugh echoing through the small studio. He buried his face in my neck, holding me so tightly I could barely breathe. And I just held on, laughing with him, my face wet with tears. My last night at the Athenaeum was quiet. I had packed up my studio, my brushes cleaned and stored, my solvents capped. The merchant's wife, her lace collar finally restored to its former glory, was ready to be returned to the gallery wall. My work here was done. Julian found me standing in the middle of the empty room. He didn't have his thermos. He just came and stood beside me, his arm wrapping around my waist. We stood in silence for a long time, looking out the arched window at the glittering city lights. "Are you going to miss it?" he asked softly. I thought about the silence, the solitude, the ghosts. "I'll miss the paintings," I said honestly. "But the silence, I don't think I need it anymore. I have you. You're much quieter than you look, but you're not silent." He chuckled, the sound a low vibration against my side. He turned me to face him, his hands cupping my face. His expression was soft, his eyes full of a love so deep and steady it still sometimes stole my breath away. "Ready to go?" he asked. I looked around the room one last time, a place that had been my entire world. It was just a room now. My world was standing right in front of me. "I'm ready," I said. He smiled, that slow, beautiful smile that had undone me from the very beginning. He leaned in and kissed me, a soft, promising kiss that tasted like coffee and sandalwood and the start of a new life. We walked out of the studio together, his hand holding mine. We didn't take the secret stairwell. We walked down the grand staircase, through the main rotunda, our footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. The marble city fathers watched us go, their expressions unreadable, as always. But I didn't feel their disapproval anymore. I felt like they were finally, after all this time, seeing me off. Julian keyed in his code at the front desk, and we pushed open the heavy bronze doors, stepping out into the cool, quiet of the pre-dawn city. The sky was just beginning to blush with the first hints of pink and orange. A new day was starting. Our new day. Our new beginning. As we walked down the steps of the Athenaeum for the last time, his hand warm and firm in mine, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. I had come to this place to restore what was broken. I never imagined I'd be the one who was made whole.